Hello and welcome to this edition of Consciousness Raising Online. I'm going to get right into this because quite a bit of information I want to try and share. And the topic, the way I phrased it, is the shame of what was done to the children. See, we're kind of aware of certain things that have happened historically, but I never see certain things put in the proper context or even put together. And what we see going on today, some people think that it's the first time it's ever happened and things like that. But what I want to do today is go back to a little history just in North America, which of course includes Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And part of a little bit more, but at least those countries. And look at some of the history of what has been done to children. For an example, let's start with now and we'll go backwards a little bit. We're aware of this whole thing about migrant children. Okay? But what we don't deal with is what, in fact, if you ask people, they say, well, they shouldn't be trying to come into the country and this, that, and other. Here's the reality. When Jeff Sessions was the Attorney General, he announced that the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security would adopt a zero-tolerance policy toward every person caught crossing the U.S.-Mexico border illegally. Now, crossing the border illegally for the first time is a misdemeanor, usually punishable by a few days in an immigration detention center and then deportation. The Justice Department and Homeland Security under Jeff Sessions and under Trump, they started prosecuting them as if they had committed a more serious criminal offense and putting them in federal prisons. Now, since children cannot go into federal prisons, they were being separated from their parents. This literally was thousands of children who became separated from their parents. And that was an entirely different immigration policy. You hear some of these folks saying, oh no, Barack Obama did the same thing. No, they didn't. They had some cases, a few cases, where they would separate children from their parents, but not as a general policy. And let me explain why that's so important to understand. Now, many of the children were fleeing from their home countries to the United States, or coming to escape violence and all kinds of things, okay? From the drug cartels and political violence. And some of this is the result of United States policies and practices through the CIA and other agencies over the years down in Guatemala, Mexico, Honduras, El Salvador. But now here's what we need to understand. Entering the United States without documents is a misdemeanor. But seeking asylum, even as an undocumented immigrant, is a legal right under the International Refugee Convention and Protocol. Let me say that again. Entering the country to seek asylum is a legal right. To apply for asylum, asylum seekers must state that they have a credible fear of returning home due to violence or persecution because of their race, religion, political beliefs, nationality, or membership in certain social groups. Now, since seeking asylum is not a crime, those who do so were typically not charged with illegal entry. Migrants can request asylum upon arrival or at any time within 1 year of entering the United States, no matter how they got there. You see the difference? They took what is an international right, the right to seek asylum, threw it out the door and just declared everybody trying to get in was an illegal immigrant and breaking the law, which again was only a misdemeanor, but turning that into a federal crime and putting them in federal prison and taking their children. So Sessions basically started directing the official to prosecute all immigrants caught entering the country without documents, even if they were seeking asylum, forcibly separating their children from their parents. And what was uglier even still is that family separation, because this is what Trump and his administration kept saying, that it was required by law to separate the children. There's no law that says you have to separate the children. But it has been a big business boom. You see these camps that I'm showing you in these graphics? These companies that are keeping the migrant children, they get millions of dollars. See, they try to keep this quiet, but there are millions of dollars that have been allocated to keep these young people, children, in these camps. And as they say, in the cages. Millions of dollars. So now that's the practice of now. And this is going to be around for a long time because they're taking these children. Where are these children? They're being kept in these camps. And the courts that keep telling them, put these children back with their parents. And the immigration authorities, ICE, says, well, we can't do that right away because we don't know where the parents are. We don't know if these are their children. And how do you separate people and not make sure you can get them back to their parents? In some cases, they've deported the parents. The children are still here in these cages. Okay? They may never find their parents or be sent back to their parents. So, and I mean, they have them, and we've seen it even in some situations. They've had children as young as 3 and 4 and 5 years old taken into the immigration courts, and they have to try to explain themselves. It's like a child, 3, 4, 5 years old, even 10 years old. What? So it's an insanity. But if you think that's insane, that's not the first time. Let's go back a little further. Let's go back to how this country dealt with Native American children. Okay? Now I'm going to focus a little bit on South Dakota for a minute, because even to this day, nearly 700 Native American children in South Dakota are being removed from their homes every year. And they've basically been violating the law. The majority of Native children in foster care, as they call it, are in non-Native homes or group homes. Now, years ago, thousands of Native American children were forcibly removed from their homes and sent to boarding schools, where the motto of the schools was, "Kill the Indian, save the man." And understand this, they were forcibly removed and put in these, what they call boarding schools, right? The children lost touch with their culture, their families, their traditions. Many of them suffered all kinds of abuse, and it left entire generations missing from the one place whose future depended on them, their tribes. You see these graphics? The Yakima Girls School. These are Native American children who were ripped from their families and put in these boarding schools. Now, that's actually a low number, 30,000, but actually they at least, it was thousands. But even those thousands, look at that. Look at that. Okay? In 1978, Congress tried to put a stop to it. They passed the Indian Child Welfare Act, which says that except in the rarest circumstances, Native American children must be placed with their relatives or tribes. It also states that the state must do everything it can to keep Native families together. But 32 states failed to abide by the act in one way or another. Nowhere was worse than South Dakota. And there was a financial incentive to remove children from their tribes. The state receives thousands of dollars from the federal government for every child it takes from a family. And it gets even more money if the child is Native American. So, for example, South Dakota removed children at a much higher rate than the vast majority of other states in the country. The children, Native children, made up less than 15% of the child population, but they were more than half of the children in foster care. Foster care in South Dakota became a great powerhouse for private group home providers who bring in millions of dollars in state contracts to care for the kids. Among them is the Children's Home Society. And you're going to hear this name again when I come back to it in a whole different situation. But this is South Dakota, Children's Home Society. Now, it's the state's largest foster care provider, and it has ties to top government officials. In fact, at one time, it was run by the governor of South Dakota, and he was on the payroll of the company while he was lieutenant governor, and while the state got tens of $millions in no-bid state contracts. Okay? Now, so essentially, in South Dakota, lots of people were making money off the children, of the Native American children. All right? A lot of them were taken and they were physically or sexually abused. Even though some were shown to grow up and become, success stories, but the main thing is that they still missed their culture and identities that they were never able to get back. What was done to them was just unbelievable. But let me show you a little bit deeper just for a minute. The state social workers, they were claiming that they were trying to make sure they put these children in native homes, in foster care native homes, right? And there's a lady by the name of Marcella Dion. She's a native foster home provider for the Crow Creek Reservation. She's got lots of room. She said her home's been empty for 6 years. She has her Indian child welfare license, but no children. Another lady named Suzanne Crow, also from Crow Creek. She said, I've been a foster parent here for over a year. They've never called me for any Indian children. In that year, hundreds of Native children in South Dakota were placed in white foster homes. Now, the officials on the Pine Ridge Reservation also say they have 20 empty homes. So a few months ago, Suzanne Crow asked the social worker why she hadn't received any Native foster children. And he said, well, there's a long process for this and a long process for that. And she said, you know what? The long process is that there's no road from you to Indian people. That's the long process. And again, they get lots of money. Every time a state puts a child in foster care, the federal government sends money. Because South Dakota is poor, it receives more money than other states, almost $100 million a year. Okay? Whew. Now that's here in the United States. And South Dakota is just an example of what's been going on in many other states. But now let's go up a little bit north to Canada. Because Canada kind of gets it's quiet. Canada has been documented to have forcibly enrolled, I love they use this word, enrolled, an estimated 150,000 children into these Canadian boarding schools. And in many of these places, several thousand children died and were buried in unmarked graves. Now, for more than a century, children were placed in government-run Canadian boarding schools. And they were led by religious authorities, and they forced indigenous children to assimilate under aberrant conditions, mistreated, abused, and denied the right to speak in their native language. Nearly 3,000 of these children were buried in unmarked graves, and their families were never notified. Now, what happened in Canada is they had a Truth and Reconciliation program. And at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, that's where you see this red banner with these people. You'll see it in a minute. That was where they revealed 164-foot scarlet banner that listed the names of all of the 2,800 children who never came home. Now, governments and churches in Canada operated around 80 different institutions for more than 120 years in these boarding schools. The first ones opened in Canada in the 1880s, and the last one closed in 1996. Now, as students, the children were prohibited from engaging in their cultural practices. Sexual abuse, by the way, was prevalent, and it's been called cultural genocide. Because, first of all, forcibly removing them from their homes and inflicting pain And according to the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, he said, we still feel the intergenerational trauma of that genocide. We see it every day in our communities. I want to show you a short video. Well, no, I'm not going to show the video now. I'm going to put it on the end just in case there's any issue with the video, and then I can always take it off in the end. But I do want to talk about somebody that, this one is so deep, I didn't even believe it. Most people didn't believe it. Okay? But I want you to remember the name. Amy Tan. Amy Tan. Sorry about that. I'm sorry, Georgia Tan. Georgia Tan. Georgia Tan. For more than 20 years, Georgia Tan ran the Children's Home Society of Tennessee. Remember I said the name Children's Home Society before? That was in South Dakota. But in Tennessee, there was also a Children's Home Society. Georgia Tan ran it, and she and an elaborate network of co-conspirators kidnapped, abused, and even killed children to sell them off to wealthy adoptive parents. Over 5,000. Would you say that? I want to say it again. Over 5,000 that have been documented. And what she did, her favorite scheme was to drive through poor neighborhoods, picking out the prettiest children, then offering them rides in her shiny black luxury car. Once the children were in, they usually never saw their families again. She took advantage of a lack of regulation around adoption to perpetuate her scheme. And this is so different. Many children died under her care, and she sold them. Think about it. How do you do 5,000, over 5,000 children? Now, what you have to understand is from the 1900s into the 1910s, formalized adoptions were fairly rare. But in the 1920s, adoption began to be marketed as a shortcut to societal improvement. According to one ad from the National Home Finding Society, adopting children would, quote, reduce divorces, banditry, murder, and control births, fill up all the churches, and do real missionary work at home and abroad, exchanging immigrants for Americans and stopping some of the road leading to war. Now, this was also at a time when the theory of eugenics was popular. And eugenics is the controlling of reproduction of genetically inferior people through sterilization. And the movement claimed that people of better genetic endowment were subject to greater infertility, and that therefore they should be able to get the best babies through adoption. Now, two things happened. That was one, that the idea of promoting adoption was a good thing. And then the popularization of baby formula. That allowed for non-nursing mothers who could now much more easily feed their babies and also to afford them. And so the demand for adoptable infants rose, especially among busy, successful women. Now, this woman, Georgia Tan, she sold babies to the rich and famous, babies that she stole. She sold them to actors and authors and entertainers, including Dick Powell and June Allison, Lana Turner, Pearl S. Buck, The New York governor, Herbert Lehman, all of them adopted Tan's babies. In 1947, Joan Crawford adopted twins, Kathy and Cindy, from Georgia Tan. They were stolen babies. Now, to kidnap and to traffic her children, Georgia Tan paid off a network of social workers, police officers, doctors, lawyers. Some of them kidnapped the children from preschools and churches and playgrounds for her. Kidnappers preyed on poor children and families who didn't have the means to fight back. And since these a lot of times were authority figures, children often went with them willingly. Sometimes Georgia Tan would approach families and offer medical or other help. And then she would tell the parents she could get their children into a clinic at no cost, but if the parents came along, they'd be charged a large bill. So they would let her take their children. And now this, of course, is before the internet, and few people had phones. But she relied on a network of spotters. They would let her know about children on the riverbanks and shanty towns walking home from school. And she would drive up in her big black car and offer them rides and snatch them. She was also in cahoots with the local judge who helped procure children, specifically from impoverished single or widowed mothers. One of her most high-profile co-conspirators was a Judge Camille Kelly, who presided over the juvenile court in Shelby County, Tennessee for 30 years. Now, the archives in Memphis revealed some of the cruelties children were subjected to. Babies were kept in sweltering conditions. Some of them were drugged to keep them quiet until they were sold. Other children were hung in dark closets, beaten, or put on starvation rations for weeks at a time. Drug addicts and pedophiles were hired to watch over them. According to the book, The Baby Thief, The Untold Story of Georgia Tan, the baby seller who corrupted adoption, sexual abuse was a common occurrence at the home. Back then, according to one adoptee, every boy in the place got molested because the male caretakers were a lot of times pedophiles. Oh, Lord. Former Tennessee Home Society employees revealed that if an infant was deemed too weak, it might be left in the sun to die. If a child had a congenital disability or is considered too ugly or too old to be of use, Tan had people get rid of them. Many were buried on the property, though about 20 to 30 children were buried in an unmarked plot of land within the Elmwood Cemetery in Memphis. Now here's the part that really got me. No one was ever prosecuted for their roles in the black market baby ring. She died of cancer before they could charge her with anything, so she was never even charged. And what they did was that in 1951, the Tennessee legislature sealed all adoption records to protect lawmakers and their influential friends from prosecution. Adoptees of the Home Society needed a court order to get their birth records. And of course, the court said, no, you can't get them. Now, it was finally in the 70s, I believe, they were able to break through. And you'll see a graphic in a minute of Mary Tyler Moore. She starred in a movie, a made-for-TV movie, I believe it was, about Georgia Tan. She played Georgia Tan. But the movie did not give any real depth to the level of crimes that this woman perpetuated. I mean, just unbelievable. Unbelievable. Yeah, Mr. Drea, genocide in the highest level. Talking about the boarding schools and stuff. But Georgia Tan, that just killed me because she did this for over 20 years, over 5,000 children. Now here's the thing, she specialized in white children. And if they could do this to white children, you know that they didn't care nothing about no black children. See, I didn't even deal with black children yet. I'm dealing with them now. Because here's the thing about enslaved children. See, there was a big difference. You know what the difference was? The big difference with slave children, with black children, African children, was that they were put to work. They were put to work. Let's go back for a minute because, see, this is not generally known, but when it came to African children, see, we know about the slave trade, right? And they brought Africans here and to the Caribbean and to Brazil, and then they were enslaved. That's why we always try to correct people when they say, well, they took slaves out of Africa. No, they didn't take slaves out of Africa. They took people out of Africa. But after, maybe, 50, 60, 70 years of bringing adults, here's what happened. They realized, slave traders and the slave breeders and the slave owners, they realized it was much easier to enslave Africans if they were children. Because children had not, they didn't have as much to change. And so they started focusing on stealing African children. Now you don't see this in the movies and films and stuff about this because, again, they would be ashamed to admit that they focused on stealing children, y'all. Now, once they stole them and they brought them to different areas of the world, the thing about what they did with us is they made us work. See, if you notice in the other situation, they put the children in boarding schools and this, that, and other, right? Well, we know, for example, that it was illegal to teach a slave how to read or write, right? They brought us here to work. So enslaved children were put to work a lot of times before the age of 7. And before puberty, the tasks given to children did not appear to be gender specific. Most children were required to take water to the fields, to tend to the animals, and care for younger children, among other duties. Since slave children were not fully functional workers, they were given smaller rations than adults. And while the slave owners had a vested interest in the survival of children as future workers and assets, there was always a constant struggle between delayed reward and daily costs. The combination of meager diet and insufficient clothes in the best of times meant that slave children were particularly vulnerable when it came to the Civil War. The Civil War brought shortages all throughout the South. Now, here's the thing that's so deep. Between 1820 and 1860, approximately 30% of all slave children born in the Upper South were taken from their families and sold to the Deep South to work in the harsher climates on plantations, picking cotton, hemp, tobacco, and in Louisiana, certain parts of Louisiana, sugar cane. By 1864, over 400,000 enslaved Africans had fled the plantations. See, it was a huge issue. If you've never seen the presentation I did about the above ground highway as opposed to the underground railroad, you should go back and look at the archives and pull that, because it makes clear what was going on. Black folks wasn't taking the land down. They didn't just say, okay, we just gonna be enslaved. They fought back, they fled, they did everything to disrupt. And during the war, one of the things that happened, many black children found that they had to go somewhere, and so they were living in what they call contraband camps during the war. This is what would happen if they fled their plantation and they got to the Union lines. They were kept in these camps. They were called contraband camps. That's because of the Confiscation Acts of 1862 officially freed all slaves that came in contact with Union lines. So within these camps, approximately half of all fleeing enslaved people were children. A lot of times in some of the camps, they died because of malnutrition and other issues. But now this is where, in some of the camps, there was an emphasis placed on education. The American Missionary Association and other organizations sent educators into these camps to set up Sabbath schools, that's Sunday schools, and primary schools. The children often worked to gain status, and so they would be digging ditches, cooking and washing, and they served in menial jobs until the Emancipation Proclamation allowed them to serve in uniform. Then they became drummer boys and buglers, teamsters, and even soldiers. But they had to work. For me, that was the main thing that came out of all of this. Not out of all of it, but especially the differences, was that we were the last to be able to get any kinds of education, and of course, those educations came from missionaries, and a lot of that went with the thing of turning us into Christians. See that? Freedmen's School. Right? And in fact, if you go to Atlanta, Georgia, to what's called, now that's Vicksburg, Mississippi, you're seeing right there. If you go to Atlanta, Georgia, to what's called the Black College Consortium, it's a group of black colleges there. There's Clark Atlanta, there's Spelman, there's Morehouse, there's the Theological Seminary, and also Morris Brown. Out of all of those five schools, those five colleges and universities, only Morris Brown was actually started by black people. Morehouse wasn't started by black people. Neither was Spelman. In fact, Spelman, the name Spelman comes from Nelson Rockefeller's wife's maiden name, because she was a big proponent of building that school to properly train Negro females. Okay. So 4 out of the 5 schools were not started by black people. You know, the same thing is true for Howard University. It's considered to be a black college, university, But even that one wasn't started by black people, and it's not even named after anybody black. If you go look it up, Howard University is named after a white guy. You know. But my point here is this. We were the last to be able to get any kind of education, and then they controlled that. Still control it to this day. But with all these other children, the Native American children, they were put in schools, which were really like prison camps, really, forcibly forced to renounce their heritage, their culture, their languages, their customs, their traditions, and try to turn them into white people. And then you have people like Georgia Tann, who is kidnapping children. And one of the things that I didn't even talk about this, but I got to mention this. In some cases, she would take white children and allow for Jewish couples to adopt them, the babies, and raise them as Jewish children. Now, these are white babies, Caucasian babies, being raised as Jewish. Okay? Boy, is that twisted or what? What has been done to children just in North America is just unbelievable. It's atrocious. I didn't even deal with other areas of the world because it's not something that's just limited to North America. Australia, they did the same thing to the Aborigines. If you ever want to see a movie that really gives you a sense of what they did, look for a movie called Rabbit Proof Fence. Yeah. But the sad thing is that in all these cases, the control of children was done to make sure that certain children they had to be in the majority. In other words, white people had to control the numbers. That's why even today, what you see happening, there's this great fear among people who identify as white, not all of them, but some of them, are so afraid that they're going to be a minority within the majority in the United States in just a few more years, a couple of decades even. And so they have been concerned about this for a long time. And so they tried to keep the numbers down. They tried eugenics. They tried mass incarceration. They've done a lot of different things, especially aimed at black people. Because what is it? We don't die, we multiply. And we're going to see more of this in the future. It's not going to end because they have to find ways to make sure that they can be the majority. Even if it's by trickery or playing with the numbers or redefining people, the key is to be in the majority. We should know the history of what has happened, I believe, because that's the only way we can protect the future. We have to know what they've done in the past. And so we can see the conditions that allowed them to be able to do that. We see the conditions today that's allowing them to take thousands of children away from their parents and lock them up. How do you do that in a country that claims there for freedom and all of that, and yet that's being done today? Well, it's the same country that allowed mass incarceration of black people and brown people, but mostly black. And it looks like at this point we might have 4 more years of the same guy. But I'm going to close now because I want you to keep this in your mind. Do some of your own research. Look at what has happened to us. Look at what has happened to our children. And see if it doesn't bother you enough to want to make some changes. As always, I say, no justice, no peace, no love. KNOW.
I was 6 years old when they took me to a residential school. I remember the day walking toward that school with my mother, and it was a silent walk. I was so afraid. 20 or 30 little kids herded into the showers, and then your body being painted in white liquid of some kind, your hair cropped and then doused in kerosene. And that was pretty traumatizing. The school held roughly 220 people, half boys, half girls, and we were segregated. If I was caught waving at my sister, there'd be a punishment for it. And so as a result of that segregation, I never really learned any social skills that young people should be learning as they grow up. From a religious and spiritual perspective, of course, the churches lobbied hard to convert indigenous people, Aboriginal people. They said that we were heathen and pagan. They targeted language in those things we had learned through all of millennia to know where we came from, to know who we were, as something that had to be eliminated. Before that time, I lived in a place called Guayastums. They call it Guilford Island now. We harvested from the forest all of the animals that we needed to provide us sustenance, and from the ocean in front of us as well, all of the species of whales and mink and fish. And I had a connection to the environment around us. And so after having spent years in those schools, by the time we were ready to leave, most of us were pretty broken. Many of us, including myself, descended into addictions, alcoholism, and violence, and it was pretty difficult. Those schools lasted for over 100 years. There were over 150,000 little children. And the last school that closed in Canada was in 1996 in Saskatchewan. There was a history on this land that had been absolutely ignored. Nobody knew about the residential school legacy. Nobody knew about the intent of the Indian Act, the chronic challenges now facing Aboriginals. And we're starting to accept the idea that we have this shared history for which we all are responsible for. When the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report was submitted, I was in the room when Justice Murray Sintler, the chair of the commission, denounced Canada. He had just recited a litany of intensive harms against Aboriginal people. And when he said, Canada, you have committed cultural genocide, there was just a silence in that room, and then all of a sudden it erupted in euphoria. We said, survivors want an apology from the Prime Minister in the House of Commons. And I was there and I heard the words, I'm sorry. And then I couldn't see because my eyes were just flowing with tears. I was so happy that somebody had said, I'm sorry. Canada, by the way, is the only Western country that has had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So we're trying to look through a new lens. We and Canadians, we as an Aboriginal, we celebrate each other, everybody cheering each other up as we move toward a more equal, prosperous future for all of us. My name is Chief Robert Joseph, and I believe that truth and reconciliation is Canada.